Here we go with lecture number 2 of 3 lectures on Martin Luther and the Mystics. This particular PowerPoint that you should be pulling up is, I don't know, I think it says something about, well, my PowerPoint says NTSW, Protestant Mystics Luther, but if you click on PowerPoint on Luther and the Mystics, that's the PowerPoint that you want. And so the title screen says Martin Luther and the Mystics, the link between mysticism and the Reformation. And so a lot of my research on Luther has centered on Bengt Hoffman's book, Theology of the Heart. And so if you go to the second slide, you'll see a picture of that book. And the role of mysticism in the theology of Martin Luther. It's actually not a new book. Manerma's work is more recent, and that will be in the third lecture. I'll talk about Manerma, the Finnish scholar, and his work. But Hoffman's work is, I think, dated 1982, something like that. But he definitely has traced the strain that he feels has been left out of scholarship on Luther in terms of this more mystical side of Luther. And he says, on the one hand, Luther chose objective terms for salvation. There's righteousness outside us, and Christ for us, and the external word. But on the other hand, he set forth this category of knowledge that belongs to the inner life. And there he used terms like experience or Erfahrung. My German is terrible, so I'm sorry, I'm not even going to pretend. Experientia, that's a Latin term, and heart, as well as to feel, to signify the importance of personal inner experience. And as I was saying in the last lecture, personal inner experience was important to Luther, although when you move in certain Protestant circles these days, you would think that it would not be important. And then in other Protestant circles, of course, it's all about experience, and the intellect or the reason is not relied on as much as it maybe should be. So what I'm arguing for, of course, is what we've talked about all along thus far, is this balance between experience and reason and scripture and tradition, that we balance all of that together. And so what we see with Luther is we see, as we saw in the last slide, that Luther is not afraid to talk about the mystical. And so he says, thus the conviction that Christ's righteousness is imputed to him who believes is without merit, is of no avail if Christ does not live within a person, an indwelling that can be experienced with mystical eyes. And this is from the book Theology of the Heart, page 19, and here Hoffman is quoting 2 Luther sermons that he preached on Good Friday, 1518. So all of these quotes are coming from Luther and his, mostly his sermons, because those, of course, were preached to the German people directly, and that's when he would talk more about spiritual matters. Now, we also find that Bernie McGinn has discussed Luther's mystical roots in his book, Mysticism in the Reformation. And in this slide, McGinn, traces the mystics that were important on Luther, and he includes Augustine, Dionysius, or Pseudo-Dionysius, Gregory the Great, Bonaventure, John Gerson, Bernard of Clairvaux, John or Johannes Tauler, and the author of the Theologia Germanica. And we're going to spend most of our time on the Theologia Germanica, but we're going to talk a little bit about Bernard of Clairvaux and Johannes Tauler. Now, McGinn points out that Augustine was hugely important to Luther, as you probably already know. If you've done any study on Luther at all, you'll know that Luther is deeply Augustinian. and that he relied on Luther for things other than just mysticism. Specifically, Luther was fascinated with Augustine's salvation story because it really demonstrated what Augustine was thinking about in terms of this grace freely flowing from God. So one of the, aside from Augustine, one of the important mystics to Luther was Bernard of Clairvaux. And Bernard of Clairvaux was deeply Augustinian, but he was also deeply mystical. Not to say that Augustine was not mystical, because we've seen that Augustine had that joint mystical experience. He and his mother Monica, drifted up to the third heaven, much like Paul did. So we know that Augustine has that mystical side to him. Bernard of Clairvaux also does. So he had a view of theology of grace. He was experiential. He knew that that we were sinful, and that we had a gift of grace and a call to inner transformation that Clairvaux believed needed to be more than just intellectual or head knowledge, intellectual conviction. He made an emphasis on the necessity of faith for justification. So we are saved by our faith. So this is, you can see how Luther is drawing this idea of being saved by faith through this mystical stream. It's not like Luther, although he presents it as if he was the first one to understand it and that this had never really existed before, but in fact he's drawing it from the mystical stream. And he says, Bernard of Clairvaux says, a life of faith never stands still. If it isn't progressing, it's regressing. And that's an important thing for all of us to remember, right? We can never kind of be lax in our life of faith. If we're not progressing and moving forward, then we are in fact regressing. We think we're holding, treading water, but in fact, we'll flow backwards. So another mystic that's important to Luther was Johannes or John Tauler. John Tauler was a German. He wrote in Germany. He wrote in Germany and he wrote in German. And so Luther really identified with him as a German, and he called him a good German theologian. Tauler had an emphasis on humility and total passivity toward God. So this idea of total surrender, you surrender your will to the will of God. Very, very typical theme in the mystics. And so this is something that Luther picked up on, but he picked up on it through the mystics. He says that we cannot save ourselves by our good works. We must wait for God's saving grace to break in. It's starting to sound a little like Luther, right? He has an emphasis on experience and not book learning. Again, we've learned that mysticism was a reaction against scholasticism. So scholasticism was all about the books, and mysticism was much more about experience. And there's this idea, as I talked about before, in terms of just this resignation of the will. You give up the will because you're letting God guide you, and a naked faith in God. So that's Johannes Tauler. And if you take a look at the next slide, now what I should explain is, and we talked a little bit about the idea of synteresis, I think, last week. Tauler was really only influential on Luther between 1515 and 1520. They had a different view of man. Tauler, following Meister Eckhart, we've talked about, believed in synteresis, this idea that despite our sin or our fallenness, God remained present in the ground of the soul, that we retain a place in our soul that is receptive to God. And so we talked about that when we talked about Evelyn Underhill, if you remember. Now, Luther did not believe in synteresis. He believed in the utter estrangement of man from God because of sin. And so he really did not believe that there was any part of us that was capable of God. So you've got this distinction then between man and God, which certainly John Tauler had this distinction, but it was not as great as Luther's distinction between man and God, or the creator and the created. Yes, this view that the human is in the image of God, but also an independent creature. And so that's Tauler would lean a little bit more toward us retaining that image of God, and Luther, of course, leans more toward the side that that image of God was wiped out during the fall. Both believe that reason alone cannot embrace God, and both believe in this idea of the dying away to the self and being filled with God. And so, turning from Tauler, we can turn to probably the most important text for Luther, the most important mystical text for Luther, and that is the Theologia Germanica. Now, this was an anonymous work. It was written by someone who was in this group called the Friends of God. We don't know exactly who. It was written in the mid-1300s. Again, it was written in German, it was written in Germany. It was a German work. I believe it was written in Latin, though. It was influential on both Tauler and Henry Suso, who was also, not as influential on Luther, but another German mystic. So Luther found this book, and he was fascinated by the Theologia Germanica, so fascinated, in fact, that he edited and published it twice, once in 1516 and once in 1518. Now, of course, you'll note that those dates bookend the very important time of 1517, when he nailed his theses to the door. So it was at a very formative time for Luther that he was really thinking about this text and thinking about it so much, and thought it was so important that he decided it needed to be published, and published twice. So he says it was championed by those who found scripture and tradition monopolized by a repressive Christendom. So this was something that Luther championed, and other Germans picked up on this. So who were the Friends of God? Now, this is a group, this was a spiritual group that lived along the Rhine in the 14th century. So we're talking the 1300s. And the 1300s was a difficult time period. This was also the time period that Julian of Norwich was alive. So I know quite a bit about the 1300s. It was a tumultuous time of war, plague, and dissension within the churches. I mentioned, this was during the mystics' time period, where there was the papal schism. There were two popes at one point in time. So there was a real sense of being lost during this time, spiritually and religiously. And so people turned from the outer life to the inner life. And we've talked about this when we talked about the importance of mysticism and kind of mysticism giving rise to the Reformation. So none of this should be too new to you. But this applies specifically to these people called the Friends of God. So they engaged in inner practices where they felt they found a foretaste of heaven. Remember, we talked about this with respect to Augustine, and this whole idea of this mystical sense that no, we can't experience heaven on earth in any sustained sort of way, but we can get a little glimpse, we can get a little taste. And they endured the cross because they were never able to achieve the reforms for which they hoped. So, like Luther, the Friends of God were reformers, and like many other mystics, they were reformers who sought to reform the Catholic Church. They perceived that the the corruption, and they really wanted to reform the church. Now, according to the scholar Anna Gross Seaschultz, the Friends were everywhere and nowhere. They were an underground group that were plentiful, but were in the underbrush. In other words, it was dangerous to step outside that Catholic hierarchy and be perceived as going against the Pope. Amazing that Luther survived and was able to do so when he did. I think that there were a lot of factors, including the development of the printing press, that enabled Luther to survive in a way that these earlier mystics couldn't rally enough support, couldn't get support of the nobles to protect them, and just couldn't achieve the Reformation goals that they had hoped for. So they really had to keep a low profile. I think I've talked about this with respect to Julian of Norwich, not even, kind of saying that she went along with the Catholic Church when in fact she was, writing groundbreaking things that went completely counter to the Catholic Church, because there was a very legitimate fear that she might be burned at the stake with the rest of the Lollards. So there was, during this time period in the 1300s, it was very dangerous to speak out. So the Friends of God did not particularly speak out in a loud way. They really kept to the underbrush. According to Bernard McGinn in Harvest of Mysticism, they were influenced by Meister Eckhart, Henry Suso, and John Tauler. Actually, they influenced Henry Suso and John Tauler, and they evinced a type of Reform pietism with a strong emphasis on mystical themes. So what did they have to say? Let's see. So the one thing that the Friends of God did was they were very careful to distinguish themselves from people who they judged to be false friends, or who they determined to be false friends. And so they tried to make sure that they were true friends of God and not false friends of God. So you can see this slide, the next slide, in slide number 10, where the Friends of God judge only themselves. They exert great effort to overcome self-love and Pharisaism. They follow the light of Christ. They practice true self-denial, and they focus on love, thanksgiving, and pure total entering into God. And then they distinguish themselves from these false friends who judge others, who love themselves over God, who follow the light of natural reason. Be careful about reason, because it can really take you off course. They turn everything back to themselves. So there's no following Christ and turning everything to Christ. They take credit for God's gifts, and then in suffering they break down in confusion and despair, because they don't have the inner strength to sustain them that the true friends of God find from Christ. And so what did the Friends of God say? They argued for an integration of contemplation and action. So, as I mentioned prior to this time, or during this time, there were cloistered monks and nuns who were not active, and then there were active monks and nuns, and they were separated. The Friends of God are saying, no, you should be a contemplative who also takes action. You should be praying, but then moving out into the world to make life better for others as well. They believed that the ideal Christian life was open to all. You didn't have to be a monk or a nun, kind of like what Luther was saying with the priesthood of all believers, right? So this may start to sound familiar to you. They emphasized a life of humility. They elevated simple people, much like Luther did, and they promoted this practice of self-emptying, of giving up one's self, or one's outward things that identify one, so that one can be joined with God. So here's a longer quote from the Theologia Germanica. It says, "It is therefore an undeniable truth that the creature is in itself unworthy, has no real claim on anyone. No one is indebted to it, neither God nor fellow man." So you can hear here that they're much more like Luther than, for instance, Johannes Tauler, because Tauler subscribes to this idea of synteresis, or that there is a remaining part of us that is godlike. And here the Theologia Germanica is saying no, that there's the creature itself is unworthy. There's no real, it has no real claim. The creature should rightly be surrendered to God's hands, subject to him. What is thus, or should be, turned over into God's hands and subject to God must also be surrendered to all creatures and fellow beings. From this submission comes true humility. If this were not the truth and the best and highest divine righteousness, Christ would not have taught it in words and fulfilled it in his life. So here the Theologia Germanica is interpreting both the gospel in terms of what Christ said, but then also what Christ did as evincing this true humility to which we are supposed to subscribe and emulate. And so what Luther was just taken with this book. He loved this book. He says he connects the book for its connection to the past. He says this book is not new. So in other words, what Luther is coming up with, when he comes up with it, he grounds what he's coming up with in this tradition. He says this is, what I'm saying, it's not brand new stuff, and it's grounded in this tradition of this ancient tradition that's written down in this book. He aligns Wittenberg theology with the Theologia Germanica. He praises its German heritage. Luther is such a good German that he likes things that are German. And he says where other texts have failed, this book more effectively leads the German people to God. So he really thinks everybody should get a copy and read this book, and that's why he publishes it twice. And he says, for this noble little book, poor and unadorned as it is as far as wording and purely human wisdom are concerned, is all the richer and abundantly precious in true knowledge and divine wisdom. So he really sees the divine wisdom within the Theologia Germanica. And he goes on to say that this is really high praise for Luther. It's pretty incredible. He says, next to the Bible and St. Augustine, no other book has come to my attention from which I have learned and desired to learn more concerning God, Christ, and man, and what all things are. So hugely high praise for Theologia Germanica. So how did it impact Luther? So for one thing, it's in the vernacular. So it's theology written in German. And so Luther turned around and wrote theology in German, and he translated the Bible into German. He decided, keep in mind that prior to this time, theology was written in Latin. And in fact, Julian of Norwich is doing the same thing, and she ends up writing in English because she wants to disseminate this information to her even Christians, to the English people. And so but most theology was written in Latin at this time. And it asserted that an ideal Christian life was open to all. And so this clearly is where Luther started thinking about this idea of a priesthood of all believers. Now, the Theologia Germanica has an emphasis on bitterness and suffering, and it has a criticism of selfish human nature and reason, and it criticizes spiritual pride, and it approves all scripture, doctrine, and the rules. Now, there's also, it emphasizes the importance of love and knowledge together. So you need to have love to go along with wisdom to understand the gospel. It focuses on humility and self-denial, and it says that it wants to remove and I left this in German because I think it translates, you can understand it better. It removed the ich und sein mich und sein mir und sein mein. So you're removing the I and the me and the my and the mine. So, we're getting rid of that whole focus on mine, me, mine, who, I am important, and really letting God shine through instead. So, how did the Theologia influence Luther? There's this idea of sin as disobedience, this idea of human nature as being completely fallen. It has Christocentric theology, focus on Christ and obedience to Christ. They're basically the Theologia Germanica, which is not, this is not an unusual theme in mystics, say that they no longer need works of themselves because God works in them. And from God working in you, then the works just naturally arise. And it's through this idea that Luther gets this idea of no works righteousness, and we can't be saved by works. And then this idea of union based on love. Now, this is the one place where Luther kind of differs. He does not emphasize love the way the mystics and the Theologia Germanica emphasizes love. Instead, he focuses on justification by faith, that faith becomes important. But I would argue that, and you'll see in the next lecture, we're going to talk about faith as not being this belief, this head belief that we tend to interpret it as, but a very wholehearted faith that includes this idea of love. So, so how does Luther incorporate the Theologia Germanica? One of the things he says is, just as the heated iron glows fire because of union of fire with it, so the word imparts its qualities to the soul. So this idea that Christ really works in us. And so, and then I want to draw your attention to the next slide where Luther sees that there are three benefits of faith. Of course, it gives us justification or salvation. It allows us to trust in God's promises. But then this third benefit is this idea of Christ as the bridegroom and the soul as the bride, and this union of the bride and the bridegroom, and Christ and the soul. And this is a deeply, deeply mystical idea. And no doubt this comes from the Theologia Germanica and Tauler and some of the other mystics that he was reading, was this idea of that we seek this union with Christ that is achieved, and according to Luther, it's achieved through faith, that we are united with Christ the way a bride is united with its bridegroom. So what do we make of all this? And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in my next lecture, but we certainly can see that this can have an impact on our everyday faith. And how so? This mystic theme of union with Christ is important. We want to pay attention to how do we experience this union with Christ. Now, how do we achieve it? Well, we're not really achieving it, right? God achieves it. Christ achieves it in us. But we have to allow ourselves to be open to allow that to happen within us. Now, certain practices, I believe, can be absolutely important to allow Christ to achieve that union in us. Bible study is important. Lectio Divina can be important. Contemplative prayer is important. You can see, I'll talk briefly in the next lecture about some of Luther's prayer practices, but Luther is a proponent of contemplative prayer. Now, he acknowledges that this is a process, that it doesn't happen overnight. Now, what I want to add is the Protestant view of mysticism as heretical is a gross overgeneralization at best, and at worst, a complete mischaracterization of Luther's thought. Whether my own pursuit of the mystic stems from naivety, bravery, or mere stupidity remains to be seen. What I can tell you is that I feel called to this work, as you can probably tell. And I think it's important that we pay attention to this because I think otherwise we have mischaracterized kind of the foundations of our faith, and especially if we go back to Luther. And if we've mischaracterized what Luther was saying, then we may have gotten off on a wrong tangent that we want to correct. So, one more lecture coming up. Enjoy. Take care. Bye.